Hello friends and constant readers, my name is Emily and welcome back to my channel. Today we are unusually close to the microphone because we are filming top down to look at books as material objects. So this is part of the Dark Tower series and I am going to specifically be looking at the physical print objects. To be honest, I don't have a plan. I haven't scripted anything. Something that I noticed while reading these books was that a lot of effort has gone into the paratext of these books. Paratext is defined as a concept in literary interpretation. The main text of published authors, the story, is often surrounded by other materials supplied by authors, editors, printers, and publishers, which is known as the paratext. When we talk about paratext, we talk about font choice, we talk about cover design, we talk about illustrations, right? Like all of this paratextual brouhaha, all of the things that have gone into the choices made in these books is part of the paratext. The plan for this video is to go through each book one by one and sort of just talk about what I'm noticing and how the paratext plays with the story, engages with the story, what we can gather as readers from the paratext. So you'll notice that I have two editions of The Gunslinger here. This is the cover that I picked up probably in the early 2000s. So this is the edition that I read during my first reading of The Gunslinger. This is the edition that I picked up with some of the funds from my patrons recently. Now the reason that I picked up this edition is because the reprint of this series that came out in 2017 was done in such a way that each cover feeds into the next cover so that you have this continual picture happening. Did I pick up the wrong book? Or am I a liar? I did pick up the wrong book, didn't I? Yeah. I think the cover choices here are especially interesting given the nature of the series as something that is very interconnected, very, like we know that there are connections between worlds, that there are connections between different pieces of literature, different pieces of King's own bibliography of works. So I think it's really neat that this series has been designed in this way so that when you put it together, they run together, right? It's a very intentional choice in terms of design. So unfortunately, I don't have different editions to compare for all of the books, but we can compare the first two books in the Dark Tower series, The Gunslinger. So in the first one, the earlier edition, you can see the crow is much more prominent. We have this sort of dark figure, possibly the man in black, possibly Roland, who knows. The text is foiled and raised, which is always a fun thing because foiling and the embossing of text, because this is an extra detail that costs money, right? This is a mass market paperback that has had some work put into it. This book, there is a subtle raising of the title and of Roland himself. The letters for Stephen King have also been raised, and I like these fading leathers. The world is falling apart, things are sort of like pulling apart and getting distant, time is getting more distant. So we sort of see that in the letters. It's a little bit looser, and it kind of looks like a screen. It's permeable. These are the letters that are the font on a lot of the editions of the Stephen King books that I picked up as a young person, like as a 10 to 12-year-old. So the first thing that we see when we open this up is Stephen King, The Gunslinger. We have a table of contents. Then we move into a quotation from Thomas Wolfe that is designed to frame our reading. There's a repetition of prison. It sort of expresses maybe the hopelessness of human existence. Then we have 19, which probably means nothing to you when you start the series. And then we have resumption, which has a huge impact when you think about the end of the series, where the Dark Tower series ends, knowing that the last line of the Dark Tower is the first line of the Gunslinger. Having this framed as a resumption, it gets at that idea of gyre right away, but because on your first reading you have no idea what this means, you just have resumption. So it's telling us that we're going to pick up in the middle of something. What we're about to read is a resuming of some sort. This edition opens with a photograph of a cowboy's chin with a crow on his shoulder. So there are some sketched black and white illustrations throughout, which is kind of cool. That's this edition of the book. Let's look at the newest edition and see if the paratext is the same. We have our table of contents again. The font has changed. We have the same Thomas Wolfe quotation, and we have 19 and resumption, and the font has changed. And okay, this may be a really weird thing, but font is important, guys. Font indicates a branding of some sort. It's making a recognizable brand, right? Like, think about the Harry Potter font and how it bugged a lot of people that the re-release of the Harry Potter series abandoned that sort of generic, probably free, to be honest, font from the UK, Canada Harry Potter books and picked up a more movie Harry Potter looking font. So we have this rebranding, I would say. It's making it look a little more old-timey, a little bit more fantasy-ish, a little medieval versus just like plain font. We have the Gunslinger, but no illustrations. So it looks like the illustrations were taken out of this edition, which is an interesting decision. These editions, to me, are doing is rebranding the series, making it a more recognizable thing. And I think this is a really important choice, especially because these were released in anticipation of the 2017 Dark Tower movie. These new editions came out alongside new movie tie-ins. I think it's interesting that some choices have been made to get this brand recognizable font, you know? So let's look at the drawing of 3, which connects. So here we have, I mean, if we want to look at both covers, what is connecting them is this gyre right there in the cover. We've got the tower in the background. We've got this crow, and actually on almost every single cover there is a crow, which is kind of a weird choice in my opinion, because really we only see that bird in the first one. It's generally a symbol of bad luck and death, which I guess makes sense based on the journey that we're going on in this book. It could be a symbol of life magic and mystery. It also symbolizes intelligence, flexibility, and destiny. And I think actually all of those things, all of those possible interpretations of the crow are very much on par for what this series is and what it is doing. Talking about the idea of destiny and fate and death, a dying world, this hopeless journey. So that's an interesting inclusion on the cover. A big thank you and shout out to the publishers who put the number of the series on the side. I love it when publishers do that. Let's have a look at book 2. We have a table of contents, only this time the table of contents has gotten a lot more intense. Where's our first table of contents? So in The Gunslinger, we just have 5 chapters. In the drawing of the 3, we have a prologue. We have a section called The Prisoner with the chapters The Door, Eddie Dean, Contact and Landing, The Tower, Showdown and Shootout. We have a shuffle We have another chunk called Lady of Shadows with Detta and Odetta ringing the changes. Odetta on the other side and Detta on the other side. We have a reshuffle, and then we have the Pusher. Bitter Medicine, the Honey Pot, Roland Takes His Medicine, the Drawing, and Final Shuffle. It's interesting to me that this table of contents has gotten a little bit more complicated. The idea of a shuffle and a reshuffle and a final shuffle makes me think of cards, like playing a card game. The idea that Roland is pulling people together on his quest. He's getting all of his chess pieces on the board. I know that's sort of mixing games, mixing metaphors, but the idea that some sort of game is taking place seems to be indicated in this layout. Also, it's divided into 3 sections. Like, he's drawing 3, and we have the Prisoner, the Lady of Shadows, and the Pusher. So we've got that breakdown of 3 there, the drawing of 3. So that's nice. It's interesting to see that it also gets more complicated. The table of contents in The Gunslinger is fairly simple, and in many ways this is a simple story. It is probably one of the more simple and straightforward stories in this series, so that the table of contents reflects that is interesting. So we know moving into book 2 that things are going to get a little more complicated. We go immediately from the table of contents to 19, that all-important number, and instead of resumption, we have a renewal. It's like a new birth. Now that he's got his catet together, like, you have a membership to a club, and so you already have that thing, and this is a renewal of it. So again, we get the idea that this has happened before. Looking back at this as somebody who's read the series, it's interesting, and I think that reading it for the first time, you're like, yeah, okay, whatever. We have the prologue, and again, we've got this on-brand font throughout it. No illustrations. This final shuffle is more part of the text than it is the extra things that the publishers are putting on, right? There's something about these shuffle bits that they're different. I'm not quite sure what to do with that. But it's interesting the way that font is used to clearly delineate sections, and it's interesting that these shuffle points are arguably some of the most important points. They mark the 3 points in the book, and they are the least in your face compared to the other chapter headings, the other section breakdowns. They are like the most quiet, inconspicuous pieces. I don't know what to do with that, but it's worth pointing out. So then we move on to book 3, The Wastelands, and once again we have the image continuing. So we've got a gunslinger figure with their 2 guns, we have a crow, and if it wasn't obvious that things are potentially going to be bad, to potentially not have the best outcome, we have a skull floating in the sky. Which, you know, it's a great memento mori. Go right into our table of contents, and this time, instead of having clear separate parts, we have 2 books, and one of them is Jake, Fear in a Handful of Dust, and one of them is Lud, A Heap of Broken Images. These now break down, instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, these are now broken down by Roman numerals, which I think is an interesting choice as well. The choice to switch from these, I would say, more modern numbering system to something a little more archaic or fancy. Like, if you really want to link this to fantasy literature, to history, to the history of the written word, these Roman numerals seem to go back farther. It's also interesting that the book is broken cleanly in half. This breaks into 3 distinct parts, which fits with the drawing of 3. I really like this breakdown. I think it works with what the story is doing. And then this breaks into 2 parts, and so we're looking at, how many parts are there to the poem The Wasteland? I've made a note for myself here in the margin here, is that a fear in a handful of dust and a heap of broken images are both lines from Eliot's poem The Wasteland, but the poem is divided into 5 sections, not 2. That's interesting. When we flip again, we have redemption. 19, our all-important number, and redemption. Redemption is the action of saying or being saved from sin, error, or evil, or the action of regaining or gaining possession of something in exchange for payment or clearing a debt. A redemption. That's an interesting framing, that this is somehow Roland redeeming himself. Do I agree with that? You know what? I do agree with that. I do agree with that, because this is the one where Roland works to get Jake back. He works really hard to get Jake back, right? So in The Gunslinger, he has sacrificed Jake Chambers for his quest, and here he redeems himself. So that's an interesting framing right off the beginning. So if we're going on Roland's journey, this is part of his redemption arc. Okay, so we're back to having some quotations to frame our reading. So we have a quotation from The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, which is where this book gets its title, where the I will show you fear in a handful of dust, that is the like subsection of this book, right? Fear in a handful of dust. The idea of dust to dust, we're getting at mortality. Humans will die. Things will die. The world will die. We have this quotation of despair juxtaposed with something that I think is hopeful from Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, which is where this series gets its name. And so we have, if there pushed any ragged thistle stalk, life and hope above its mates, the head was chopped. So immediately we go from life and hope to despair. And then in this last quotation, we have Robert Aikman, Hand in Glove, and it is, again, this idea of renewal, of hope, of flowing water, of cleansing, right? What river is it? Inquired Millicent idly. It's only a stream, well, perhaps a little more than that. It's called the Waste. Again, we get a linking to this despair, juxtaposing hope and despair throughout these framing quotations. I think, oh, I cut that off. I did not show you that the whole time. Oops. This is our framing for the thing that we're about to read. It's something that is both and, I think. Then we move on to Book 4, Wizard and Glass. We've got that death panning on either side, which I think is actually kind of clever if we think about Charlie the Choo-Choo rushing to kill these humans, and then right at the beginning, that's where we pick up. So like death bookends the end and the beginning of this narrative. The sections have changed once again. We have a prologue, part 1, riddles, no breakdown. Part 2, Susan, again, no breakdown. An interlude, Kansas somewhere, some when. Part 3, Come Reap. Part 4, All God's Chillin' Got Shoes. This had 2 books in one, and now we're breaking it down into parts again. There is no numbering, no subsections. Why? This is one of those things that bothered me and intrigued me with this series. Once again, we open with 19 and our R word, which is regard, which I think makes sense because we are about to get a huge flashback into Roland's past. We're going to spend a lot of this book basically sitting still, not moving forward. We're going to flash back to Roland as a young person and watch him fall in love and watch him gunslinger and watch his life fall apart a little bit. Again, this word is a great framing. And then we're back with quotations again. It was the drawing of 3 that had no framing quotations, correct? It's an interesting choice that the Gunslinger opens with framing quotations, but the drawing of 3 does not. We have a scene from Romeo and Juliet, which is a Shakespearean tragedy, which is pretty apt considering how Roland's romance goes. With The Wizard of Oz, like, that is where we're ending this book, meeting the wizard. We're getting a little bit lost. I haven't the faintest notion of which way it lies. We're not really sure how to get back to Kansas anymore. Oh, there's another one! Oh boy, bonus. Okay, so the last one is another quote from Child Roll Into the Dark Tower Came, but this time they didn't put the quotations around the poem. I am disappointed in whoever formatted this because this is not how you cite a poem. Who taught these people how to cite things? Yeah, they totally did it correctly in the first one. All right, somebody goofed. So we have chapters, we have numbered chapters, but they didn't feel the need to break them down in the table of contents like they have in the past. So let's look at 4.5, which was done later. On some printings of this book, this is more clearly green and fades into the next one. Like in the picture on the back, it looks to me that this is more green and like clearly fits into this illustration better. When you actually put them together, they clearly don't. So it's almost like there's a break in the series, but this book also doesn't fit either, but it feeds right into Wolves of the Kala. So I think this break in the cover design is interesting and odd because so far everything has flowed one into the other. But maybe this makes sense as well because this book is sort of an afterthought. Like it wasn't published in this order, but it can be read in this order. And maybe this indicates to us, like the cover design indicates to us that the publishers feel they should be read in this order. You know, that this is how the story flows, the images flow this way, or at least whoever designed these covers thinks that they flow this way. Also, I think these covers are stunning. Every time I look at them, they make me happy. This is not part of the series proper. We don't have a table of contents. There is no 19. There is no R word. It's not even in like the same on-brand font, even though these were released at the same time. Everything has been in this Dark Tower font, like, you know, the Harry Potter font. This is the Dark Tower font. And so even though this is a Dark Tower novel, the font indicates to us that this is something else. Like this whole series was published at the same time. Like this reprint of the series was published at the same time, and yet the font would like us to know that this is not a part of the series proper. Feeding on from there, we're going to go to Wolves of the Kala, which is book 5. As we can tell, this feeds into it. The cover shows this orb, this wizard ball, perhaps, and we have a whole bunch of cowboys running it. We have the tower in the background. For me, this sort of reminds me of the Eye of Sauron, just in that there's an orb and like a slit in the middle. I think that for a lot of people who are familiar with the visuals of The Lord of the Rings from the movies, this might be reminiscent of that. And also we have roses. So up until this point, we haven't had any roses on the cover, but now we have this field of roses that's happening on the bottom. They will continue to bloom across the next 2 novels that we look at. What the hell? Remember that only this earlier edition of The Gunslinger had these illustrations in it. So now we open this up and we have a different font. It is not what I have come to establish as our branded font. So you open this up and you're like, what the fuck? What the fuck, publishers? Then we have this table of contents that these letters actually look a lot more to me like the font for the new releases of Harry Potter. We've abandoned this sort of old-timey font. There is a drop shadow behind the font. It's a little more crooked. And to me, the font change is super bizarre because all of these books were printed at the same time. So like, who the fudge designed the reprint of these novels and decided to format the font this way? Why? I actually find this a little bit hard to read because it's kind of quirky and typewritery, but also sort of childish. Once again, we have the book subsections and we have the chapters broken down with Roman numerals. They decided to bring that back. As I pointed out before, that was abandoned. Like, this book has chapters that are numbered, chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but they weren't included Now they're included again. We have 3 parts and an epilogue. We move into quotations. The choices here are interesting. Firstly, we have Mr. We Deal in Lead, which is Steve McQueen in The Magnificent Seven. Okay, Google, who is Steve McQueen?
According to Wikipedia, Terrence Stephen McQueen was an American actor.
So we have the quotation from an actor. Rodney Crowell is an American singer-songwriter of country music. And then we have a quotation from Roland Deschain of Gilead, a fictional person. So we have 2 real people, and first come smiles, then lies, last is gunfire. It's just a bizarre choice. Remember how 19 was always on the one side? Like the first 3 Dark Tower books that we looked at, the 19 always appeared on the left-hand side of the page, and our R word appeared on the right. Now we have 19 on the right-hand side and the R word on the left. I'm interested about what this might mean, especially because the series arguably breaks at this point. Like, if we look at the way the covers are designed, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. So if we look at it like this, we almost have 2 arcs happening here if we see that break in the illustration. It's interesting that in this break in the illustration, we also get a break in the pattern of where 19 and our R word occurs. Also, we have this big, goofy drop shadow font compared to what I have come to think of as the branded font, right? It looks a little bit shaky, which I guess if the world is falling apart, but we have resistance. That is our R word framing Wolves of the Kala, which makes sense because that is what they are doing in this novel. They're resisting the Wolves of the Kala. It's probably the most traditional fantasy battle thing that happens. I will say that I like that 19 is so big because 19 is important, and now the 19 looks important. Okay, also throughout this one, we start to get illustrations again. I think it's strange the paratextual decisions that are being made in this book. This font is different than this font. Who slapped this book together? So basically all of the subsections now include a little illustration. Each part of the book has a little illustration. We have these, who knows what these are? We have a rose, which makes sense. That's a big thing in this story. And we have cactuses. Not sure what these illustrations add. It almost feels like somebody at some point paid for these illustrations and they were like, we're gonna put this on this empty page. So a lot of weird choices start being made to the paratext. So let's look at book 6. Book 6 is one of my favorite in the series. It is Song of Susanna, and this has no gunslingers, has the crow really front and center, and the rose. It has the big rose on the front, and the rose is really important in this book, so I think that makes sense. It almost looks like they've paid for these illustrations for other editions of the book, and they're like, we've paid for it, let's pop it here. At the front of this book, we have this wacky, inconsistent font and illustration. I don't think this is the same illustrator. They don't look like the same styles. I don't know what this is supposed to be. It also has a slight shadow around it, which looks to me like somebody cut it out of one document and plunked it on this page. Like, it has a dark background. Doesn't look very professional, shall we say. And again, the font has changed. Then we have an illustration of the door. We have quotations from Jake Chambers. Go then, there are other worlds than these. So that image of the door goes with that quotation. Again, we have a quotation from a fictional character that we're being reminded of. We have like a traditional saying or story. And then we have a quote from Leif Enger, Peace Like a River. It's a weird mix of things to frame our reading of the text. Fair is whatever God wants to do. We open up with a really weird table of contents. We have this sort of energy looking image here. The weird childish font that I mentioned before is gone, and this is broken down into stanzas, which I think makes sense given that this is called Song of Susanna. This table of contents frames this as if we're reading some sort of song or poem or piece of music. Once again, 19 is back on the side of the page that I'm accustomed to seeing it. We have it back on the left-hand side, a lot bigger. The font has changed again, and this time we have reproduction, which in this case is pretty literal because Susanna is pregnant, but perhaps it's also a reproduction of things that have happened before with the reproduction of Arthurian legend in here. What happened to Wolves of the Kala? Like, who designed this? Why'd you do this? So that sort of breaks my theory that we're into some sort of new part of the book, and all of the numbers are going to be flipped to this side. Like when I pulled the camera out before and had all the books lined up, there's no rhyme or reason to this. So we have come to the final novel. We have Roland standing, presumably Roland, standing in front of his dark tower. The tower is shrouded in death. So, I mean, right from the front of this book, we should know that things aren't going to go well. A couple of quotations here. 3. We have a quotation from Child Roll Into the Dark Tower Came, which brings us back to our series roots. We have I was born, 6 gun in my hand, behind a gun I'll make my final stand, from Bad Company. And we have What Have I Become, My Sweetest Friend, Everyone I Know Goes Away in the End. You Could Have It All, My Empire of Dirt, I Will Let You Down, I Will Make You Hurt, by Trent Reznor. We've got crows. So a flock of crows is called a murder. So it's a little ominous. We have a table of contents back again. Once again, we are changing format. I think it's probably most similar to book 3, where we have the part, and then we have the chapters broken down with Roman numerals. We definitely deviate from stanzas, which like wouldn't make sense in this context, right? Like this is Song of Susanna, so of course we're gonna have stanzas. There are more parts to this book. It opens with a deviation. So we have 19, but now we have 99. It's the year 1999, right? It's pre-2000, that whole Y2K thing. We have reproduction, revelation, redemption, resumption. And this right here, my friends, is what a gyre is. Got the drop shadow on it. We've got a little bit of drop shadow happening on this old one. We've got drop shadow happening on these as well, a little fancier, but we've deviated from a consistent font choice yet again. It's interesting that we're going from reproduction here right into reproduction being our first word. These words, I suppose, indicate to us what is going to happen in this final novel. It's going to be a reproduction. We're going to get some revelation, we're going to get some redemption for our characters, and then this whole thing is going to resume. We're going right back into the gunslinger resumption. We've got an image. It's taking up a lot more space. I would love to get my hands on some earlier editions of the series and see, like, was this produced specifically for a certain edition? We've paid for it, let's throw it in. Was this produced for a different edition? We paid for it, let's throw it in. These sketches remind me of the more old-timey sketches. These look like they should probably be in color somewhere. Like, I just find the inclusion of illustration interesting and a little bit weird because these illustrations remind me a lot of children's literature. Children's literature has a lot of like black and white sketches in them. I love that this includes Child Roll Into the Dark Tower Came. It is in the final book of the Dark Tower series that Child Roll Into the Dark Tower Came is included. The appendix is something that we get at the end of Tolkien's novels as well. So it's interesting that this has been included here because it would almost be nice to frame your reading of the text with this. But if this series is designed to flow, we have the series coming full circle so that by the time you get to the end, the man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed. You get the appendix of Child Roll Into the Dark Tower Came, which you might read, and then move right back into the gunslinger, your resumption. The man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed. Interesting formatting choices were made throughout the series. I think more and more I am interested in seeing, apparently I can't count and put the books together. Hang on. Now the covers are all sticking up. So I think it is really interesting to think about these design choices because a lot goes into designing books. I would love to pick the person who designed this reprint's brain, but I would also love to pick the brain of somebody who works in book design. There is a lot happening in the paratext that you can choose to engage with as little or as much as you want. Like, I think all of the clues are there for you to figure out how the series goes, how it's going to end, just based on the material that we're given with these books. I also think that they're just incredibly visually stunning books. I'm looking at them now in the viewfinder and they look great. They look vibrant. And keep in mind that these were published in 2017. These are very Instagrammable books. These are very aesthetically pleasing books in ways that this edition of The Gunslinger is not as visually appealing. And so I think this choice says something about the audience, the readership that these editions are trying to pull in. What I want to take away from this is that paratext is important. Paratext plays a role in how we experience texts, in how we engage with texts. There's a lot that's been gifted to us here, and it is clever, it is clearly lovingly done, maybe in all of the cases except for book 5. Whoever designed book 5, maybe they were having a rough day, because like, what the fuck, book 5? I would love to hear your thoughts on the paratext, on the books as physical objects. I'm sure that you are reading different editions of these books. Maybe some of you are reading the same ones, but if you have older editions, if you have picked up a UK or US or book in translation, like international copy of these books, have all of the same choices been made? If you have different editions of the books that are doing different things, please feel free to take pictures and tag me in them on Instagram at EmilyCaitReads. I really look forward to seeing a community response to book design, like the paratext of books. So let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Engage with me on social media. Before we go, we have to thank my patrons. Thank you, patrons, for making videos like this and other long-form projects possible. I really appreciate the work that you are enabling me to do. If you are interested in becoming a patron, links to the Patreon page are in the description box down below. And of course, tiers 2 and 3 of my patrons have early access to videos. So before these go live on YouTube, they are with my patrons first. And any support is helpful. Like today, this tripod that I am filming on was purchased with the funds from my patrons. It was actually a real treat to be able to buy my own fancy pants tripod because up until this point I have been borrowing other people's tripods. Patrons make this possible. They are much appreciated. Until next time, long days and pleasant nights.